Okay, so welcome to the sixth, so the middle set, like the straight in the middle installment of the 2022 interdisciplinary speaker series of the ethics of argumentation. And today we have an extremely exciting topic presented to us by Dima Mohammed on the transmissibility of commitments in public and political arguments. Dima Mohammed works at the Nova Institute and the Nova School of Social Sciences at the University of Lisbon, Portugal, one of the most beautiful cities I've ever been to. So I'm very jealous because I'm in Alberta. And she's been working on public political arguments a lot. And I just love her work. Sorry, that's a weird thing to say in the middle of an introduction, but I just do. So I'm really, really excited about this talk. And Dima is a very important member of the kind of organizational part of argumentation theory, because she's involved both with the Association for Informal Logic and Critical Thinking and the European Conference of Argumentation. She's in the middle of both of it. So she's a very important speaker to have on this, and I'm really excited for her talk. As always, we're going to be recording the talk, but not the question period after. And if you have a question after, if you think of one during the talk, you can already put your name or a Q into the chat, and that way we'll make a line. People can stand in line virtually that way. So thank you so much for being here, Dima. I'm very excited to hear what you have to say. Please take it away.
Thank you so much, Kat. Thank you, Andrew, also for inviting me to the Ethics of Argumentation Speaker Series. It's a great pleasure. It's a wonderful initiative that you started already almost 2 years ago now, and I'm really, really happy to be one of the speakers in the series. So let me share my screen. I have a PowerPoint, and then I can start. You can see my screen, right? Yes, okay. So my talk today is about a subject I've been working on for a bit. So I have a lot to share already, but it's still, and I think it will continue for a bit to be work in progress. So I'm really happy to share what I have so far with you, and already looking forward to your comments, feedback, suggestions. So let me start by this small introduction. I don't know if you've seen this image before. In February 2018, Jim Fitzpatrick, Irish artist, has published this image of a young girl holding a Palestinian flag and staring at us. On the right side, down on the picture, there's the logo of the Wonder Woman film, and on top of it, it says, "There is a real Wonder Woman." The woman in the picture is Ahed Tamimi, at the time 17 years old, from the Nabi Saleh village in Palestine. She became famous after she had been detained in Israeli military jail after slapping an Israeli soldier who had entered her home. She was charged with 12 counts of assault, including incitement to violence and assaulting Israeli soldiers, Israeli security forces. By the time Jim Fitzpatrick had published this image, there was already a big international outcry about the case of Ahed. The case of Ahed Tamimi put on the spotlight the unfair military system that Israel is imposing on millions of Palestinians, and the human rights abuses that are the consequences of this military occupation, especially human rights abuses of children. There was a strong solidarity campaign, international groups, Amnesty International, and surprisingly, this time also high officials, for example, British Minister of State for the Middle East, had said at the time that the soldier shouldn't have been there and the young woman shouldn't have needed to do what she did. At the time, the Israeli Minister of Education, now Israeli Prime Minister, asked for Ahed Tamimi to be jailed for life. So the image that Jim Fitzpatrick published came in that context. And as he explained, he felt the need to express his solidarity. Jim Fitzpatrick had been famous for presenting to the world the famous black and red Che Guevara picture in the 1960s. So he said that he felt compelled, like in those days, to show solidarity with the Palestinian children that are suffering under the Israeli occupation. What I find interesting in this picture, apart from all this controversy, is the kind of disclaimer that is included in it. So like on the left bottom of the picture, Jim Fitzpatrick includes copyright information, but also credits. He writes Wonder Woman logo, copyright DC Comics. Also that this image has been inspired by a photograph, by a picture by Haim Schwarzenberg, Israeli photographer. And interestingly, he says, this picture may not be used by anti-Semitic individuals or organizations. So I find this disclaimer really interesting. As a disclaimer, it's an attempt by the artist, clearly, to distance himself from some undesirable association with anti-Semitic individuals or organizations. But the question here, why make such an undesirable association present if it's really undesirable? I mean, basic rhetoric, why do that? And the reason is that, unfortunately, in the public sphere, the association between solidarity with Palestine and anti-Semitism is present in a type of slippery slope fallacy. So you start with expressing solidarity with Palestine, which quickly goes into some criticism of Israel, which in principle is legitimate. I mean, you can criticize in principle any state in the world, but that criticism of Israel is quickly turned into some disgusting blame the Jews, anti-Semitic discourse. So the association between solidarity with Palestine and anti-Semitism is unfortunately there in the public sphere. A fallacy, but it's there. Furthermore, unfortunately, there will be some voices, some anti-Semitic voices that are going to take advantage of the plight of Ahd Tamimi and other Palestinian children in order to propagate some anti-Semitic arguments. So this will happen as well. So in that sense, Fitzpatrick's disclaimer is an attempt to distance himself from that unwanted association and argumentative potential. And I think it's a very smart and careful one. Think of it, he doesn't say, he doesn't say, I'm not saying that. He's not actually reproducing the argument that he doesn't want to evoke, basically. And he's using the anti-Semitic label to refer to the individuals and groups that he doesn't want to associate with, which is already very negative. So he's actually presenting them in a very negative light. So it's not the same way as saying, and I'm not trying to say, it's a very, I would say, carefully crafted disclaimer. So argumentative association. So I've been saying he's trying to dissociate himself or prevent some argumentative association. Let's think of argumentative association or argumentative associates of an arguer A as those arguers who share with arguer A some general positions. And such association may be based on membership of an institution. Think of all political bodies, for example, governments, prime ministers, and ministers. But it can also emerge on the basis of collective action, for example, going together on a demonstration, but also maybe signing a petition. We're going to see another example of that. But it can also emerge on the basis of convergence of positions expressed by arguers, so between arguers who align together in public controversies without necessarily having a clearly defined frame of association beyond the positions taken voluntarily. And this is the case of Fitzpatrick. So he's not, the only association that can emerge is going to be based on the convergence of positions expressed in public. An important consequence of the argumentative association is a defeasible transferability of commitments. So an arguer may be attributed the position of her argumentative associates in the area where they are associates, as long as she does not distance herself from their positions. This is what I have suggested already in two papers in 2019. And as an example, just to give more body to these thoughts, let's examine very quickly a case that I have analyzed in detail earlier. the clarification and apology published by Catherine Deneuve, French actress in Libération in the 15th of January 2018. The clarification and apology came out following the outrage provoked by the French anti-Me Too manifesto, in which 100 famous French women joined a letter rejecting the naming and shaming of men defending the freedom to pester and urging women to respond in ways other than closing off in the role of the prey. The apology came also after a TV debate in which one of the signatories of the letter, so an argumentative associate of Catherine Deneuve, stated that one can have pleasure during rape. So in the apology and clarification, what Catherine Deneuve writes is, I feel strongly compelled to voice my disagreement today with the way some signatories have appointed themselves media spokesperson, twisting the essential meaning of the text in the process to state on national television that a woman can climax during rape is worse than spitting in the faces of all the women who have had to endure such a crime. So Catherine Deneuve felt compelled to clarify and apologize because in virtue of signing the Anti-Me Too manifesto together with Brigitte Lahaie, they became argumentative associates. By means of the apology, what Catherine Deneuve tried to do is again to distance herself from the argumentative association, as well as from the undesirable argumentative potential that had been attributed to the manifesto and which had been strengthened by the association. So she says, of course, nowhere in the petition does it say that there is anything good about harassment, because actually that there is something good about harassment is something that has been attributed to the manifesto by the critics of it. So because in the manifesto, one of the things that it says that a woman can enjoy being the sexual object of a man. Of course, when we say that a woman can enjoy being the sexual object of a man, you don't necessarily mean to say that there's something good about the harassment, but in the context of all that has been said in the controversy, in the manifesto, also the declaration of Brigitte Lahaie, it became a stronger argumentative potential of the manifesto, at least strong enough for Catherine Deneuve to feel the need to actually deny it. So it's one of the argumentative potential, you could say, of this part of the text, but giving the argumentative association with Brigitte Lahaie, it became really important that this argumentative potential is negated by Catherine Deneuve. So the argumentative potential, when we think of it, what is at stake is a type of presumptive attribution of commitments that is derived from the public recognition of certain premise-conclusion pairs. So the starting point here is an understanding that public arguments do not start from void, nor do they happen in isolation. Every time a new premise is advanced, the premise builds on already existing lines of arguments. The already existing lines of arguments include premise-conclusion pairs that have been repeated and which have become publicly recognizable. The idea that discursive choices acquire argumentative potentials beyond what is explicitly said is not new. It's in line with something quite old, for example, that the theory of Anselm and Ducrot, that there is an argumentative aspect inherent in every form of language, but also with some literature in discourse analysis that focus on intertextuality and interdiscursivity. Basically, arguments are not happening in void. So one way of thinking of argumentative potential is by means of standing standpoints. That's the proposal that I made that time. So in the absence of evidence to the opposite, and that's the defeasibility or the presumptive nature part, an arguer who advances an argument X or premise X may be committed to the standpoint Y if in the public discourse X has been associated with the justification of Y. So basically, the standpoint is standing in the same sense of a standing declaration. So it takes effect only once a certain context is in place. So you advance the premise, the conclusion is evoked, and unless you do any effort to deny that conclusion, this is a standing standpoint. So the argumentative potential may be activated by the content of a premise as well as by the choice of formulation made when advancing the premise. So thinking of the transmissibility of commitment, the first thing that comes to mind, at least the extreme of it, is the fallacy of guilt by association, of course. In a more recent work, Tyndall and Groke presented a form, guilt and honor by association. It's a form of argument that can be either fallacious or not. So it's an argument form that attributes guilt or credit to a person or group on the basis of some association that is known or thought to exist between that person or group and some other person or group Y. In a good guilt by association argument, there is a good reason to believe that the alleged association between X and Y really exists. There's a good reason to question the beliefs or the behavior of Y in the form of guilt, and in the form of credit, there is a good reason to credit the beliefs or the behavior of Y. And finally, there is no good reason to differentiate between X and Y. So basically, this is an argument form. It's not always a fallacy. Sometimes it is reasonable, sometimes not. Inspired by that, I'm going to propose that we look at argument by association. So not just guilt or honor. So argument by association, or I'm still not sure, maybe commitment by association. This is something to think about. So here we can be talking about a presumptive attribution of commitment C to an argumentative agent X on the basis of some association that is known or thought to exist between that agent X and another agent Y. When this is justified, there is a good reason to believe that the alleged association between X and Y really exists. This is the same condition that Groke and Tyndall presented. The second and the third conditions are slightly different. So then the second condition, I propose to think that X has activated a certain argumentative potential that could warrant the attribution of commitment C. So it's not that you can just by identifying the association, you can transfer all the commitment. You need to activate a certain argumentative potential that warrants the attribution of commitment. And X has not canceled the argumentative potential that can incur commitment C. And I'm going to show by example how we can apply the conditions. So a justified transmissibility of commitment between argumentative associates requires the activation of a certain argumentative potential and remains presumptive. So you need to identify the association. You need to identify a premise that has been advanced and that has the argumentative potential to bring the transfer or transmit the commitments. And you need to be sure that the person has not canceled. For example, Fitzpatrick has canceled the argumentative potential that he didn't want to acquire. And here I'm changing. So earlier I had talked about transferability of commitment. I think transmissibility is more accurate here because the commitments are not lost on the other part. So they are transmissible, but they remain also where they started. Thinking of commitments in argumentation, I think we can think of a good tradition of registering arguers' commitments in order to account for how argumentation is conducted, basically. The idea of commitment store of Hamblin, idea that in order for an arguer to be consistent, there need to be a register of their previous statements and commitments. And here what we get also is that the commitments need not to correspond with real beliefs, but will operate in general approximately as if they did. Important work has been also done by Walton and Krabi, especially on the way that commitments are dialectically incurred and lost. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit. There has been also a distinction in the literature between two views of commitments. Commitments as content, which the speaker can be said to have taken for granted in making his or her utterance, versus commitment in terms of belief and truth, which is a specific attitude of the speakers towards content or what she has uttered. There is also some work on commitment attribution. All these will be actually really useful for the continuation of the project. So the idea of how the commitments are attributed, basically. So commitment attribution, understood as the naive or pre-theoretical appraisal of commitment by conversational participants. And this is so much in line, actually, with the idea of argumentative potential. And finally, there has been important work to discuss not just commitment to literal meaning, but also commitment to implicated meaning, which is also really crucial here, because I'm talking about commitment to implicit or implicated meaning. I'm going to talk about the difference also in a bit. So from Walton and Krabi, I think it's really important to see they have a really, really beautiful system on how commitments, for example, are incurred They say perhaps the most obvious way is for a speaker to incur commitment through his own direct or indirect speech act. However, commitments can also be incurred by a subject through someone else's action, which is what I'm looking at in this case. Some commitments arise through relationships or affiliations. When they discuss how a commitment is lost, also they speak about having a commitment by having maintained it, by retracting it, or by having it cancelled, which is what I am interested in also. So it can be cancelled by one's own inaction or action, by actions of others, by circumstances, or by overriding commitments. They also speak about commitments being sticky, and this is something that we will see in the case study I'm going to present in a bit. They cannot always be retracted without some explanation, criticism, or penalty. So it's not that you can just say, I don't want to be committed to that. So you need to justify, basically. And they speak of one's commitments as something personal. That is, it is indexed to a distinct person or individual. And they may even be, in some cases, private and only partially accessible to others. And this is a bit of a complication, of course. So this got me to think a little bit. So commitments are as something personal. I leave out for now the private and only partially accessible to others, even though I think it's also very important. And I'm saying that because when I started thinking of all these projects, the idea that politics is inherently collective was in my mind. So thinking of commitments as personal got me to pause a little bit. The idea of considering argumentative association for me is important in order exactly to capture the collective nature of politics. So political actors function as part of institutions, which may confer on them some positions that have not been assumed individually. Generally speaking, we have here an institutional transferability of commitments that renders fellow members of a certain political institution argumentative associates in relation to positions relevant to the institution. Of course, typical examples, and that's where I started actually, are prime ministers and their government, party leaders, and senior party members. So the transferability of commitments at this high level of political agency is crucial for the exercise of accountability. It's not that a government, one minister can do something and the rest of the government can just say, it's not us that did it. Or a party leader can do something and the party can just say, it's not us, basically. So even though a politician can, in principle, disagree with positions of her institution, and that happens, when this happens, justification is due. So this is part of the stickiness of commitments that Walton and Crabbe talked about. So I went back and wanted to confirm this idea that political is as inherently collective. And this is actually reflected in the definition, or the definitions rather, of politics and the political. So of course, taken for granted, as Hagen and Harrop put it, a crisp definition of politics, one which fits just those things we instinctively call political, is impossible. Politics is a term with varied uses and nuances. Perhaps the nearest we can come to a capsule statement is this. Politics is the activity by which groups reach binding collective decisions through attempting to reconcile differences among their members. In this following definition by Garner, politics is the process by which groups representing divergent interests and values make collective decisions. Strauss already in 1968 wrote, all political societies, whatever the regimes, surely are groups of some kind. Hence, the key to the understanding of the political must be a theory of groups in general. Finally, I have this definition that I like particularly also by Leftwich. Wherever we live and work in groups, wherever we live and work in groups, and whatever we do in our collective, productive, and social lives, we are always engaged in activities of conflict, negotiation, or cooperation in the use, production, and distribution of resources, and that relations of power are always central to them. That is, we are constantly engaged in politics. So, can we speak of collective commitments, basically? And I have to be a bit more careful here. We can speak of collective commitments, but we have two senses, and maybe we need to distinguish between them. We can speak of collective commitments in the sense of commitments of individuals within a group. So like they are, for example, collective decision-making. But we can also speak of commitments of groups, so collective in the sense of collective agency and collectivism, in the sense of it's not that it's the collection of the commitments of individuals, but it's a commitment of a group that is passed on to individuals. And I tend to think that the transmissibility of commitment I'm talking about is more in the second sense, but it's not all only. So I think it fits in both senses, but the two are important to distinguish analytically. I'm at this stage, I don't have very clear, it's an intuition. I don't have a very clear image of how they will be different, but I can see that they will have different implications for the attribution of commitments. So the different types of being collective. And this brings me to the case study I would like to share with you, where all these concepts are applied, and maybe the benefits are clear, but also what needs to be done becomes also clear. I'm going to discuss with you the case of the Portuguese Communist Party position on Ukraine. So it's a very, very recent case. It's still developing, but the analysis I have has stopped. So it's in the period between March and the end of April this year. Of course, to start with, I think we have to admit a context. We have a history of relations between communist parties in general and the former USSR, continued, albeit differently, with Russia. We have a history of antagonism also between communist parties, including the Portuguese Communist Party and the USA. And we have to take into account the support of the USA for Ukraine to join NATO. So as a starting point, we can say that the Portuguese Communist Party, the PCP, may be expected to stand with Russia and against the role that the USA is playing in Ukraine. So we can say that to start with, as a starting point, PCP and Russia may be presumed to be argumentative associates when it comes to the crisis in Ukraine. However, as such, we don't have any grounds for attribution of position. Attributing a position without an argumentative potential being activated would be a case of a fallacious guilt by association. But this is crucial. It's just that it's not enough to start attributing positions. We can, however, start attributing positions if you consider the vote that members of parliament, members of the European Parliament from the Portuguese Communist Party had on the 1st of March 2022. There was a resolution that condemns Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine, demands that the Kremlin end all military activities in the country, and calls for sanctions on Russia. And PCP members voted against it because they said the resolution instigates escalation, for example, by deepening the militarization of the EU and the mobilization of NATO military forces. Immediately, the PCP was accused of considering the Russian invasion of Russia justified, refusing to basically the vote against the resolution acquires the argumentative potential of condoning the invasion at least based on a polarized understanding of the situation. We have, I think, here a false dilemma. Either you support the resolution or you condone the Russian aggression. But this actually is also backed by the argumentative association between the PCP and Russia. So we have here a standpoint that has been attributed to the Communist Party. That is that the Communist Party considers the Russian invasion of Ukraine justified, and it has been attributed on the basis of the argumentative potential of voting against the condemnation of the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. We have here a two-way transmissibility of commitment between the two MEPs, so the vote goes to the party, but also the argumentative association of the party also transmits commitments to them. On the same day, there was also an official communique by the Portuguese Communist Party in which they tried to explain the vote. So they said it is necessary to defend dialogue and peace, not the increase in policy and measures that are all at the origin of the escalation of the conflict in Europe. The PCP reaffirms its consistent position against war and in favor of peace. And finally, the PCP condemns the path of interference, violence, and confrontation resulting from the 2014 coup d'etat promoted by the US in Ukraine, which was followed by the recent Russian military intervention and added to the intensification of the US warmongering escalation by NATO and the EU. it's basically what they're trying to do. They're trying to cancel the standing standpoint that the PCP considers the Russian invasion justified by offering an alternative argumentative potential for the vote against the resolution. So the vote against the resolution is not a sign that they are that they consider the Russian invasion justified, but the vote against the resolution is because of all of these, because they're against war and in favor of peace and all these things. So that's the communique that has been issued on the same day. And we have finally also on the same day, João Ferreira, a member of the Central Committee of the party, who was also the candidate of the party for the presidential elections in Portugal, who spoke on CNN Portugal. And since he described the vote of his fellow members of the party as an act of courage and lucidity, the measures in the resolution will not affect any Russian oligarch, he said. Only the people of Russia, Ukraine, and even Europe will suffer. And he said very clearly, the Russian actions, the invasion of Ukraine must be condemned. So Ferreira, an argumentative associate of the two Communist Party members of the European Parliament, feels the need to explain the vote. He does not stop at offering an alternative argumentative potential like they communicated, but he also is explicit in condemning the invasion. So basically, he has a standpoint of the PCP, you can say, because of the transfer commitments, the PCP condemns the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And here we have a multi-way transmissibility of commitments between the party, the two members that voted, João Ferreira, and of course, Russia as argumentative potential in argumentative associate in the background. So the story with condemning the invasion or not didn't finish there. So despite the fact that João Ferreira said it clearly in the interview, the media continued to refer to the PCP refusing to condemn the invasion on the basis of their refusal to actually vote in favor of the resolution. So almost a month and a half later, even more than a month, almost 2 months later, every time the Secretary General of the Communist Party was interviewed, he had been asked about does the Communist Party condemn the invasion of Ukraine? And of course, in the media, it has been presented that the Communist Party does not. So the Communist Party considers the invasion of Ukraine justified. So in a market in Alentejo, the PCP Secretary General is pressured to speak about that once more, and he says, we are facing a capitalist Russia in which there are economic and financial groups from which the PCP clearly demarcates itself. So explicitly dissociating the PCP from Russia. Furthermore, he says there was a military intervention that he's saying the PCP condemns the Russian military intervention in Ukraine as a standpoint of the PCP. However, using the language of military intervention, conflict, war, reinforces actually the undesirable argumentative potential of condoning the invasion, as well as the argumentative association between the PCP and Russia, because it's the same language that Russia uses, basically. So consequently, the sincerity of both the dissociation and the condemnation is compromised, is undermined by the choice. So at the end, the standing standpoint that the PCP considers the Russian invasion of Ukraine justified is still there, at least because of the language used, which activates this argumentative potential. On the same day, interestingly, another Central Committee member, Antonio Filipe, speaks on a Portuguese TV, SIC TV, and he says, you want me to say there was an invasion? There was, and the party has always condemned the invasion. So what we have here, by using the word invasion, Antonio Filipe is making another attempt to avoid the argumentative association with Russia and to curb the undesirable argumentative potential that had been strengthened by the reluctance to use the term by the Secretary General, for example. So we have another standpoint by the PCP. The PCP condemns the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So at the end, what is the position of the PCP in relation to the invasion of Ukraine after all? So Unfortunately, I'm not going to give a clear answer on this because I think it's part of the complication that we still have to find tools to deal with. So to sum up, we have a historical context that warrants the expectation of argumentative association between the PCP and Russia. In the polarized context in which we live today, the vote of the PCP and members of the European Parliament against the resolution that condemns the Russian invasion of Ukraine acquires the argumentative potential of attributing to the PCP a position that justifies the invasion, even if they are trying to say something different. If uncurbed, this argumentative potential would warrant a transmissibility of commitment between the PCP and its argumentative associates. So members of the European Parliament, Secretary General, members of the Central Committee, as well as Russia. So the standing standpoint that the PCP considers the Russian invasion of Ukraine justified is there and is attributed to the PCP. The efforts of curbing this undesirable argumentative potential, and I'm saying it's undesirable because we have two members of the committee that are clearly, explicitly denying it, but it's not actually, does not succeed, the effort does not succeed. So despite the attempts to cancel them, including by explicit dissociation and condemnation, the use of neutral terms, for example, military intervention, strengthens both the association with Russia and the standing standpoint condoning the invasion. The media's inaccurate, biased coverage plays an important role too. So, for example, in that part of João Ferreira speaking to CNN Portugal, even though he says it's clearly in minute 130 that the PCP condemns the invasion, the video is put in a piece of news with the title, "The Communists Refuse to Condemn the Invasion," because they refuse basically to vote. They voted against the resolution. The party's commitments are not easy to establish beyond official communiques, which commitments of which members are transmissible and which are not, for example, and in which direction. So which is stronger? Do we say that the Secretary General commitments are transmissible, but not the members of Central Committee? Do we take the members of Central Committee, two of them, to be more, their commitments are more transmissible? I mean, it's really difficult to say. I think the only thing I can say here is that we have a party divided. So the party is divided in relation to Russia. And is it possible to determine what the commitments of the PCP as a party are? I'm not sure. But I think this is a question that is worth investigating. We need to have some answer, even if not definite answer. But this is something that I think is a challenge that we need to commit. So to conclude, I would first sum up. My starting point was for this project, but also in this talk, was a need to account for a type of transmissibility of commitments in order to improve our understanding of argumentative practice, as well as to enhance the possibility for accountability in public political arguments. My proposal is to study the argumentative association, or maybe commitment by association, with a focus on the transmissibility of commitments, or maybe more generally attribution. I'd like to study argumentative association with a focus on the transmissibility of commitments. And to do that, it is essential to consider the argumentative potential of argumentative moves, basically. So a justified transmissibility between argumentative associates requires the activation of a certain argumentative potential and remains presumptive. So you cannot transmit the commitments without the arguer having activated something that can bring this commitment to her. When I think of argumentative potential, it's important to keep in mind that the argumentative potential refers to the possible argumentative inferences a certain discursive choice can activate beyond what is explicitly stated. So think of the affirmation, "My body, my choice," which has returned to our public sphere really strongly in the last months. A common argumentative potential associated with the statement is opposing the control and criminalization of sexuality and reproduction. So the affirmation has been associated with the defense of the position in such a way that the two have formed what I would refer to as a premise-conclusion pair an inference that is publicly recognizable. Whenever the affirmation is made, the position is invoked, even if it is not explicitly articulated. And here it is really crucial to distinguish the intention of the arguer from the attribution, the contribution the argument can make. So both are important and can overlap. But the argumentative potential an argument has is not restricted to the justificatory force intended by the arguer. Distinguishing between the two is important in order to account for the way the public arguments work without over-attributing commitments to arguer. So I would say I'm not actually concerned. I'm not attributing any intention to the arguer with the argumentative potential. I'm attributing a commitment though, but it's important to keep in mind that this commitment is presumptive. It can be denied after it has been attributed, or even better, it can be cancelled in advance to prevent the commitment attribution. So we have the two cases. Hindenhoff tried to deny the argumentative potential after it has been attributed, and Jim Fitzpatrick tried to cancel it before it would be attributed. We need to keep in mind that commitments are sticky, as Orton and Krabi say, so we have to investigate further the conditions for retraction. And we need to remember that argumentative potential is context dependent, including particularly audience dependent. So the same premise will not have the same argumentative potential with different audiences. So we have to think of different degrees of argumentative association and different directions and conditions for the transmissibility of commitments. So before I finish, I'd like to say that there are a few directions to continue this job. As I said, this project is still and will be work in progress for a while. So some important theoretical issues need to be addressed. And I have two main venues. The first one, thinking of the argumentative potential as a type of implicit meaning. With all that comes with that, all the philosophy, the pragmatics that come with it. So for now, I can see that argumentative potential, so the standpoint, for example, are basically implicatures. But in a recent case I'm analyzing now with hate speech in Portugal, I can see that sometimes the argumentative potential is also an instance of insinuation. So these kind of pragmatic mechanisms that are involved in the argumentative potential need to be investigated. We need to keep in mind also issues such as meaning underdeterminacy. So when we think of argumentative potential, can we be sure of all the argumentative potential there is? Of course not. So this is something to further explore also. And I'm also tempted to think of some argumentative potential as non-propositional meaning. This is a big challenge, so I'm not sure when exactly I'm going to do that, but this is a direction that needs to be explored. The second venue for theoretical issues to be addressed has to do with commitment attribution. So more work needs to be done still to have a solid basis for the attribution of commitments to implicit content. I'm glad many colleagues are working on that already, so I hope I can benefit and contribute to that. And we need to think a little bit more on what are the commitments of a group. I mean, the case of the Communist Party in Portugal is a really good case, especially what are the commitments of a political of a group in a political context. So these are the issues. I'm sure there are more. So I'm going to stop here, and I look forward to your question, feedback, comments, or anything you want to share with me.